Kingston was 71 when his world seemed to blur in ways he couldn't explain. It began one quiet evening at the kitchen table when he leaned down to read the label on his wife's jar of jam and realized the words swam together like ripples on water. At first, he laughed it off, joking that maybe the letters had started dancing without him. But deep inside, there was a tremor of unease he couldn't shake. He had always prided himself on sharp eyes, the kind that could spot a robin perched on a fence or the small print of a crossword puzzle. Yet now the certainty of that gift felt like it was slipping away. The next morning, the sunlight seemed harsher than usual, glaring through the window as he tried to read the newspaper. He squinted, rubbed his eyes, even tilted the paper at odd angles as though the words might realign themselves if he just coaxed them enough. His wife, Eleanor, noticed the strain etched into his forehead. "You're frowning too much, King," she said softly, her hand brushing his arm. He smiled faintly, but the truth was harder to ignore. That creeping blur wasn't just a bad night's sleep, it was the slow erosion of something vital, something he thought he could always depend on. It wasn't long before Kingston found himself sitting in the familiar sterility of the optometrist's office. The doctor spoke gently but firmly, explaining what Kingston already suspected. Age was catching up to his eyes. The beginnings of macular degeneration, perhaps, and the inevitable dryness that came with years. Kingston nodded, polite as always, but inside, his heart dropped like a stone. Glasses were offered as a solution, thicker lenses to patch up what time had taken. He tried them on, staring at himself in the mirror, but what he saw wasn't clarity, it was surrender. For a man who had spent his life working with his hands, building furniture in his small workshop out back, eyesight meant more than just reading or driving. It meant the ability to carve, to sand, to notice the grain of wood and imagine what it might become. Losing that felt like losing a part of himself. That night, when he returned home, he sat in silence while Eleanor prepared tea. She didn't need him to explain. She could see it in the heaviness of his shoulders, in the way his gaze lingered not on her but on the floor. The thought of a future blurred and dependent gnawed at him, but life has a way of offering small signs when we're open to seeing them. A week later, Kingston's neighbor, Arthur, stopped by to borrow a tool. As they chatted, Arthur mentioned something curious, an oil he had begun taking that seemed to ease the strain in his own aging eyes. Kingston chuckled, skeptical, but Arthur's earnestness was hard to ignore. "You know, King, I used to fumble with my glasses every morning," Arthur said, "but lately, things just feel clearer. I'm not saying it's magic, but it's worth looking into." That night, Kingston lay awake, turning the thought over like a stone in his palm. He had heard of castor oil, his grandmother swore by it, but this was different. Arthur spoke of another oil, something richer, something that seemed to carry not just moisture, but life itself for the eyes. The name lingered, bilberry seed oil. Kingston whispered it to himself in the quiet, as though trying on a secret he wasn't sure he believed. Eleanor found him the next morning in the garden, staring at the rows of beans and tomatoes he had planted in spring. "You're thinking again," she teased, handing him a mug of tea. He smiled, but then admitted his fear that the world he loved was growing dimmer by the day. She listened, patient as always, then placed her hand on his. "King, maybe it's time to try something new. What do you have to lose?" Those words, simple and steady, became the spark he needed. So Kingston began. He ordered the oil, capsules first, then later the liquid. The routine was small, a capsule with breakfast, a drop of liquid in the evening. It felt almost too simple for something that promised so much. But as the days unfolded, he noticed subtle shifts. The paper no longer felt like a chore to read. The soft lines of Eleanor's smile seemed sharper again, like the world was gently returning its details to him piece by piece. Still, it wasn't just the oil that changed him. It was the way he began to see himself, not as a man defeated by age, but as someone willing to adapt, to fight for the pieces of life that mattered most. He found himself lingering longer in the workshop, sanding the edge of a chair he had nearly abandoned. He noticed the small veins in the wood, the delicate knots, the imperfections that somehow made it beautiful. His eyes were working for him again, and with them his spirit followed. Of course, there were moments of doubt. There were days when the blur returned, when he wondered if he was fooling himself. But then he'd remember the alternative, the surrender of relying fully on glasses, of letting go of the craftsman he was. That thought was enough to steady him. He wasn't chasing miracles, only hope, and in that pursuit, he found strength. Eleanor watched the changes quietly. She saw the light return to his gaze, the confidence in his posture. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, she leaned against him and said, "You look like yourself again." Kingston chuckled, a sound that carried both relief and gratitude. For him, this journey wasn't just about eyesight. It was about reclaiming the clarity of life itself, one small step at a time. And so, Kingston's story began not with defeat, but with a choice. A choice to try, to believe that even at 71, transformation was possible. He hadn't just found an oil, he had found a way forward. And in that quiet, stubborn act of faith, he discovered something many forget as they age. It is never too late to see life clearly again. Kingston sat in the waiting room, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair as the sterile smell of the clinic filled his senses. He had always dreaded these visits, the bright lights, the endless charts, and the quiet nods of doctors who spoke in clinical tones that seemed to drain hope. Today felt no different, except that deep inside, Kingston carried a secret he hadn't yet shared with anyone in that room. For weeks, he had been taking something that wasn't prescribed by a doctor, but whispered by a friend, suggested like a lifeline at the edge of despair. And in the silence of his own mornings, he thought it might just be working. When the optometrist finally called his name, Kingston rose slowly, steadying himself. His wife, Eleanor, gave him a small, encouraging smile as he disappeared into the exam room. The doctor adjusted the machine, asking him to read the smallest line he could see. Kingston leaned forward, his heart pounding, not just from nerves, but from the strange, cautious excitement that had been building inside him these past weeks. He blinked, took a breath, and began to read. The letters weren't perfect, but they were sharper than before, cleaner. He stumbled only once, catching himself with a quiet laugh. The doctor frowned slightly, then leaned back in his chair. "You're doing better than last time, Kingston," he said, almost surprised. "Your vision hasn't declined, it's improved." Those words, simple as they were, settled into Kingston like a spark in the dark. He nodded, pretending not to make much of it, but his mind was racing. He thought of the small capsules he had been swallowing each morning, of the drops he sometimes let melt under his tongue. Bilberry seed oil, Arthur had called it. Better than castor oil, something that worked deeper, not just on the surface. As he left the office, Eleanor slipped her hand into his. "How was it?" she asked. He smiled, shaking his head as though he couldn't quite believe it. "He said I'm better," Kingston whispered. "Not worse, better." Eleanor's eyes softened, and though she didn't say it, she knew how much those words meant. For weeks, she had watched her husband struggle, the man who once read novels into the night, now squinting at recipes or setting aside his woodwork for fear of cutting the wrong line. To hear improvement, it was as though someone had opened a window in a room that had grown too stuffy to breathe. That evening, Kingston sat at his workbench. The chair he had abandoned months ago still rested in the corner, the wood half-sanded, its grain hidden beneath rough edges. He picked up a piece of sandpaper, held it against the wood, and ran his hand along the surface. Slowly, the lines began to show again, not perfectly, not like they once had, but enough to see the story hidden in the wood. For the first time in a long time, Kingston felt himself coming back. But the oil was more than just medicine, it was a choice. Every time he reached for that small bottle, he wasn't just hoping for clearer vision. He was choosing not to give up. He was choosing mornings spent in the garden, afternoons in his workshop, evenings reading the paper aloud to Eleanor. He was choosing to see. And though he didn't understand every reason why it worked, he felt the difference in his bones. Of course, doubt lingered like a shadow. Was this just a coincidence? A momentary trick of the light? Was he imagining clarity where none existed? Kingston carried those questions with him, but the truth was in how he felt each day. The squinting was less. The strain in his temples had softened. He could look at Eleanor across the room and see not just the shape of her face, but the small curve of her lips when she smiled. These were not small things, they were the very threads of life he thought he might lose. When Arthur stopped by again, Kingston pulled him aside, lowering his voice as though sharing a conspiracy. "You were right," he said. "The oil, it's doing something." Arthur grinned, his eyes crinkling. "Told you," he replied. "It's not about miracles. It's about giving your body a chance to do what it's meant to do." Kingston nodded, though he still held his skepticism close. But when he went to bed that night, he whispered a quiet thank you to the dark, not sure if it was for the oil, for Arthur, or for the stubborn part of himself that had chosen to keep trying. In the days that followed, Kingston found himself more present. He lingered in the garden longer, noticing the delicate lines of veins on each tomato leaf. He returned to his crossword puzzles, pencil in hand, squinting less and smiling more. Eleanor would catch him humming under his breath, a small tune that hadn't left his lips in years. To her, it wasn't just his eyesight that seemed to be returning, it was him, the man she had always known, the man who refused to fade quietly into age. One evening, as the sun slipped low behind the trees, Kingston sat with Eleanor on the porch. The air was cool, the sky painted with soft streaks of orange and violet. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I thought I was done. I thought I'd have to give in to it. The blur, the glasses, the rest of it." He paused, then looked at her, his eyes clear enough to see the reflection of the sky in hers. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's still more left for me to see." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her smile steady. "There's always more, King," she whispered, "always." And in that moment, Kingston realized the oil wasn't just helping his eyes, it was helping him see life again in all the ways that truly mattered. Kingston never thought twice about glasses when he was younger. His father wore them, his grandfather too. It seemed like just another sign of age, as natural as gray hair or slower steps. But the day he put on his first prescription, something inside him resisted. The lenses felt like a barrier, a reminder that his eyes were no longer his own. They magnified the words on the page, yes, but they also magnified his awareness of what he was losing. At first, he wore them only when necessary, reading the fine print on a bill, threading a screw into wood, glancing at road signs while driving. He'd slip them on reluctantly, then take them off again as quickly as possible, as though the very act of wearing them made the blur worse. Eleanor noticed his stubbornness but didn't press him. She understood. Kingston wasn't vain. He had never cared about wrinkles or thinning hair, but his eyes, his ability to see the world clearly without aid, that felt different. It was a kind of freedom he wasn't ready to let go of. The trouble was, glasses weren't just a convenience, they became a tether. He started misplacing them, spending long minutes searching under newspapers or beside the couch. Once, he left them on the porch and spent the better part of an afternoon retracing his steps. Each time it happened, frustration welled up in him, not at the glasses themselves, but at what they represented. It was as if he had been handed a new weakness, one he couldn't quite accept. That was why the small changes he began to notice after taking bilberry seed oil mattered so much. It wasn't that the world suddenly snapped into perfect focus. Life rarely worked in such dramatic strokes. But there were mornings when he realized he had read an entire column of the newspaper before remembering to reach for his glasses. Afternoons when he sanded wood at his bench and caught himself following the fine grooves without needing magnification. These moments were fleeting at first, but they stitched together slowly, forming a quiet proof he couldn't ignore. Eleanor was the first to point it out. "You haven't touched your glasses in hours," she said one evening as they played cards at the kitchen table. Kingston looked down, surprised. She was right. The deck was clear in his hands, the numbers crisp under the warm light. He laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe I'm just finally memorizing the shapes," he joked, but his heart knew better. Something inside him was shifting. Around this time, he noticed something else. He wasn't alone. At the community center where he and Eleanor sometimes attended health talks, he overheard conversations, neighbors sharing small victories, stories of clearer vision, of putting down glasses more often. Some spoke of dietary changes, others of supplements, but the theme was the same. They weren't willing to accept decline without question. These weren't miracle tales of eyesight restored overnight, but quiet accounts of seniors taking back little pieces of independence. Kingston listened, absorbing their words like threads of encouragement weaving into his own story. One afternoon, Arthur stopped by again, this time carrying a tray of seedlings he wanted to share. As they knelt together in the garden, Arthur leaned close. "You know, King, it's not just about seeing words or leaves clearer. It's about not feeling trapped by those lenses all the time." Kingston nodded, wiping dirt from his hands. "I never thought it would bother me so much," he admitted. Arthur chuckled. "That's the thing. Glasses don't just sit on your nose, they sit on your mind. And when you start to need them less, you feel like yourself again." The words echoed in Kingston's chest long after Arthur left. That night, as he sat in his chair by the fire, glasses resting on the table beside him, he realized what had been gnawing at him all this time. It wasn't just the inconvenience, the searching, the smudges. It was the quiet voice that glasses carried with them, the one that whispered, "You're slipping, you're fading, you're not who you were." And when he found himself going longer without them, that voice grew quieter. He wasn't ditching the glasses entirely, he still reached for them when he needed to, but he was ditching what they represented. Surrender. The change didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor. She saw the lighter step in his walk, the way he lingered over his woodworking again. She saw him lift his head more often, scanning the horizon instead of peering down through lenses. One evening, she set her teacup aside and said, "You look freer, King, like you've shaken something off." He smiled softly, realizing she was right. It wasn't that he no longer needed glasses at all, it was that he no longer felt chained to them. The freedom wasn't only practical, it was deeply emotional. When Kingston walked into the library and picked up a book without immediately fumbling for glasses, he felt a quiet surge of pride. When he tended to the garden and noticed the veins on a leaf, he felt gratitude. These were small victories, but they carried weight. They reminded him that aging didn't have to mean giving up piece by piece until nothing was left. It could mean finding new ways to hold on to what mattered. He still kept his glasses close, of course. They sat in their case, worn when necessary, but no longer the permanent fixture they had threatened to become. And in that space between needing them and not, Kingston discovered something unexpected. Hope. Not the wild hope of miracles, but the steady hope of progress, of resilience. The kind that grows quietly inside a person when they realize they're not as helpless as they once thought. By the time weeks had passed, Kingston was no longer just a man adjusting to vision changes. He was part of a quiet movement, one that stretched beyond his home, his garden, even his community. Seniors everywhere were beginning to challenge the inevitability of glasses, not by denying reality, but by searching for ways to support their own bodies. For Kingston, that meant a bottle of bilberry seed oil, a choice he had made with skepticism but held onto with faith. For others, it meant different paths, but the message was the same: we are not done yet. And so, as Kingston closed his book one evening and set it on the table beside him, he glanced at his glasses, folded neatly in their case. They were no longer symbols of decline, no longer burdens he carried with resentment. They were tools, nothing more. His vision was not perfect, but his perspective was clearer than ever. He wasn't just seeing the world better, he was seeing himself differently. A man still capable, still present, still choosing to live with open eyes. For much of his life, Kingston had heard whispers about castor oil, as though it were a cure-all tucked into every grandmother's cabinet. His own mother used to speak of it in hushed tones, insisting it could heal nearly anything if taken at the right time. And when his eyesight began to falter, castor oil was one of the first remedies that crossed his mind. He read about it in old articles, saw mentions on television, even noticed bottles tucked away in health stores. The thought lingered, a small spark of hope he might cling to. He tried it once. Eleanor had picked up a small bottle at the market, its label promising relief for dryness and irritation. That evening, Kingston tilted his head back and let a drop fall into each eye. The sensation was strange, almost soothing at first, as though his eyes were being coated in a protective layer. For a few hours, the blur seemed softened, the irritation less sharp. He wanted to believe it was working, that he had found something he could hold on to. But by morning, the familiar haze returned. His eyes felt dry again, his vision no different. The effect was fleeting, like mist that vanishes with the rising sun. He didn't say much about it to Eleanor, but she noticed. "Did it help?" she asked gently as she poured his tea. Kingston shrugged, not wanting to admit his disappointment. "A little," he said, "but only for a while." He didn't want to speak the truth aloud, that it had felt like a bandage on something much deeper. His fear wasn't just dryness or irritation, it was the quiet march of decline, and castor oil, for all its small comfort, couldn't hold back that tide. The realization left him restless. He hated the thought of temporary fixes, of patching over what time was eroding. He wanted something more lasting, something that gave his body strength rather than masking its weakness. It was around then that Arthur's words about bilberry seed oil began to echo louder. Arthur had said castor oil soothed, but bilberry nourished. At the time, Kingston hadn't grasped the difference, but after his own experience, the contrast became clear. One was like a splash of water on parched soil. The other promised roots reaching deeper, drawing strength from within. Kingston thought back to his days as a craftsman. He remembered how sometimes, when a chair leg cracked, he would patch it quickly with glue just to keep it standing. But the real fix was always in replacing the weak piece with stronger wood, sanding, shaping, and anchoring it firmly. Castor oil felt like the glue, helpful in a moment, but never enough to truly restore. Bilberry seed oil, though, seemed to offer that stronger wood, something his body could build upon. This wasn't just about oils and remedies, it was about how he viewed his own aging. For too long, Kingston had accepted surface-level solutions because that was what was offered. Glasses to mask the blur, drops to mask the dryness, pills to mask the aches. None of them touched the heart of what he longed for, strength from within, a body capable of standing on its own. That was why his disappointment with castor oil was so heavy. It wasn't just the oil failing him, it was the reminder that quick fixes rarely offered the life he wanted. Eleanor, wise as ever, saw his struggle. One evening, she set aside her knitting and said, "King, maybe it's not about what doesn't work. Maybe it's about finding what does." He looked at her, the firelight flickering against her face. She was right, of course. He had spent too much time mourning what failed him instead of embracing what might carry him forward. And so, with quiet determination, he shifted his focus. The more he learned about bilberry seed oil, the more it made sense. Stories of circulation, of deeper nourishment, of antioxidants that worked like unseen guardians for the eyes. He didn't grasp all the science, nor did he need to. What he understood was simpler. When he took it, he felt something different. Not a fleeting relief, but a gradual return of steadiness. He could read longer without strain. He could work at his bench without the frustration building so quickly. These were not miracles. They were small mercies, the kind that built hope day by day. One afternoon, as Kingston sanded the frame of a chair, Arthur dropped by again. "Still trying that old castor oil trick?" Arthur asked with a knowing smile. Kingston shook his head. "No," he replied. "I gave it up. It's like patching a hole in the roof with tape. Might hold for a rain, but not a storm." Arthur laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Exactly. That's what I've been saying. Sometimes we settle for what's easy instead of reaching for what's real." That night, Kingston thought about all the ways he had settled in the past few years. The glasses he wore grudgingly, the drops that soothed for a moment, the quiet acceptance that aging meant shrinking into smaller pieces of himself. But now, something inside him stirred. He wasn't chasing youth, nor was he chasing perfection. He was chasing presence, the ability to live each day with eyes open, not dulled by the blur of compromise. The lesson of castor oil stayed with him. It reminded him that not all remedies were equal, that some were meant to soothe while others were meant to strengthen. He had no bitterness toward it. It had served its purpose in its way. But he no longer placed his hope in quick comforts. His eyes, his life, deserved more than that. As he sat with Eleanor on the porch one evening, watching the first stars appear, Kingston spoke softly. "It's strange, isn't it? How something can help just a little and yet show you how much more you really need." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes the small helps lead you to the greater ones," she said. And Kingston, listening to the crickets and feeling the cool air against his skin, realized she was right. Castor oil had shown him its limits, but in doing so, it had opened his eyes to the possibility of something better. For the first time in a long while, Kingston didn't feel like a man losing pieces of himself. He felt like a man beginning again. It was a quiet morning when Kingston first held the small bottle in his hands, its dark glass cool against his palm. He turned it slowly, reading the label more than once, as though the words themselves might reveal a secret hidden within. "Bilberry seed oil," he murmured under his breath, the syllables unfamiliar, foreign even. He wasn't a man easily swayed by trends or flashy remedies. For 71 years, he had relied on the steady, the proven, the things that lasted. And yet, here he was, standing at the kitchen counter, staring at a bottle of oil that had come into his life through nothing more than a neighbor's encouragement and a whisper of hope. Eleanor, ever observant, watched him with a smile. "You look like you're about to make a deal with it," she teased, setting her teacup down. Kingston chuckled, though the truth wasn't far from her words. He was cautious, yes, but there was something inside him that longed for this to be true, for this oil to hold more than just the promise of moisture, more than just another patch over the holes of age. He wanted strength, renewal, a reason to believe that his body still had fight left in it. He began slowly, one capsule with breakfast, swallowed with a sip of water. The first few days, he felt nothing unusual, but there was comfort in the ritual. It felt intentional, a choice made for himself. Soon, he added the liquid form, letting a drop linger beneath his tongue before swallowing. It was bitter at first, earthy, but not unpleasant. He thought of Arthur's words, "It nourishes, King. It doesn't just soothe, it nourishes." Those words carried him through his doubts. The first shift was subtle. He found himself lingering longer over the newspaper, realizing with surprise that he hadn't squinted as much. The familiar strain at the edges of his temples was softer, less insistent. Then came the workshop. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, Kingston noticed how clearly the fine grooves of the chair frame appeared under his hand. The wood seemed to reveal itself in greater detail, the knots and veins more visible. He paused, heart quickening, realizing it wasn't just his imagination. Something was changing. But the real power of bilberry seed oil wasn't only in the clarity of his vision, it was in the way it began to restore his confidence. He no longer reached for his glasses as often. He no longer felt the same heaviness when Eleanor handed him a recipe to read or when he looked across the yard at the rows of beans and tomatoes. Each small success built upon the last, stacking like stones in a wall of hope. And with each passing day, he felt less like a man fading into age and more like someone reclaiming his place in the world. One evening, Eleanor noticed the difference too. They were sitting on the porch, the air warm with the hum of summer insects. She leaned closer, studying him. "You're seeing me differently," she said with a smile. Kingston raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She laughed softly. "The way you look at me, it's clearer, like you're not straining anymore." He felt a lump rise in his throat because she was right. For the first time in months, he could see the lines of her face without that familiar blur softening them. And those lines, etched by years of laughter and love, were more beautiful than ever. As days turned into weeks, Kingston found himself more curious about this small seed that seemed to carry so much strength. He read what he could, not in search of scientific jargon, but in search of understanding. Words like anthocyanins and circulation floated through the pages, but what mattered most to him was simpler. This oil wasn't just coating his eyes. It was feeding them, strengthening them from within, giving them what they needed to withstand the wear of time. That was the secret Arthur had spoken of. That was what set it apart from all the fleeting fixes he had tried before. The change wasn't only physical, it was deeply emotional. Kingston began to rise each morning with a sense of purpose. The act of taking the oil reminded him that he was still capable of choosing life, of choosing to fight for what mattered. He wasn't waiting passively for decline to swallow him. He was participating in his own story, carving out a future where his eyes could still guide him through the work, the reading, the loving gaze he shared with Eleanor. He shared his experience with his daughter one Sunday when she visited with the grandchildren. She listened intently as he explained, her brow furrowed with concern at first. "Dad, are you sure it's safe?" she asked. Kingston smiled, nodding. "I've checked, and I've spoken with Arthur too. It's not about chasing miracles, it's about giving myself a chance." She softened, seeing the resolve in his eyes. "Well," she said, hugging him tightly, "if it's helping you see your grandkids better, then I'm all for it." And indeed, that was one of the quiet joys, the way he could watch the children running in the yard without fumbling for his glasses, the way he could catch their smiles, their small gestures with greater ease. These were the moments he feared losing, the treasures he thought would blur away. To have them return, even in part, was a gift beyond measure. As summer deepened, Kingston realized that bilberry seed oil wasn't just a supplement. It had become a symbol of resilience, of hope, of the quiet truth that even in the later years of life, one could still discover new strength. Its secret power wasn't in the capsule or the drop. It was in what it awakened inside him, the will to see, the will to keep going, the will to believe that his story was still unfolding in beautiful ways. One night, as he closed the workshop door and looked out at the twilight settling over the garden, Kingston whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not only for the oil, but for the neighbor who had shared it, for the wife who encouraged him, for the body that still responded when given the chance. He no longer felt like a man slipping into shadows. He felt like a man standing once more in the light. And in that simple truth, he discovered the real secret of bilberry seed oil. It wasn't only about clearer eyes, it was about clearer living. The mornings had become Kingston's quiet sanctuary. Long before the world stirred, he liked to sit by the kitchen window, cradling a warm mug of tea while the sky shifted from gray to gold. In those moments, he could hear the creak of the old house, the distant call of birds, and the steady breath of Eleanor still asleep in the other room. But lately, these mornings carried something more, a ritual that had begun to anchor him, a small habit that seemed to be changing the course of his days. He reached for the small bottle, unscrewed the cap, and held the dropper between his fingers. Just one capsule with breakfast or a drop under his tongue. Such a simple act, almost too simple for the hope it carried. But as he swallowed, he felt a sense of resolve take root. It wasn't the oil alone, it was the choice to show up for himself, day after day, to believe that consistency could do what quick fixes never had. The first few weeks, Kingston doubted. He had lived long enough to know that habits were easy to start and even easier to abandon. How many resolutions had slipped away in the busyness of life? How many health kicks had ended with disappointment? But this felt different. Perhaps it was because the habit was small, easy to fold into his day. Perhaps it was because he could already sense subtle shifts, the way his eyes didn't ache after reading, the way he noticed details he thought were lost. Whatever the reason, this simple act began to weave itself into his life, like stitching that held a garment together. Eleanor noticed the steadiness too. "You're sticking with it," she said one morning, watching as he set the capsule beside his plate. Kingston smiled. "It's become part of me," he replied. He thought about how habits shape a life, how the smallest choices ripple outward in ways we can't always measure. It reminded him of the garden. Plant one seed, tend it with patience, and over time it grows into something that nourishes. That was what this habit had become, a seed planted in the soil of his days, watered by hope, strengthened by routine. The impact stretched beyond his eyes. The discipline of the habit brought with it a sense of rhythm. Kingston found himself more intentional in other ways, choosing healthier meals, taking longer walks with Eleanor, lingering in his workshop not out of obligation but out of joy. The oil was at the center, but it was the habit itself that reshaped his perspective. It reminded him that age did not rob him of choice. He could still decide, still act, still nurture his body with care. There was a particular morning that stood out. Kingston had poured his tea and opened the newspaper when he realized he had been reading for 20 minutes without once reaching for his glasses. He set the paper down, leaned back in his chair, and let the moment sink in. It wasn't a miracle, it was the fruit of quiet consistency, the reward of a habit kept. He thought of all the days he might have skipped, all the excuses he might have given, and he knew that if he had, this moment wouldn't exist. Later, when his daughter called to check in, Kingston mentioned it almost shyly. "I've been keeping up with something new," he said. She listened, curious as he explained his routine. "It doesn't sound like much," he admitted, "but it's making a difference." She paused, then said warmly, "Dad, sometimes it's the small things we do every day that matter the most." Her words lingered, a reminder that transformation rarely arrives with fanfare. It arrives in the quiet, through choices made again and again. Eleanor often teased him about his devotion to the little bottle. "It's like your morning prayer," she said once, her eyes twinkling. And perhaps it was. For Kingston, the habit was more than physical. It was spiritual. It reminded him each day to trust, to be patient, to believe in growth he couldn't always see. It tethered him to hope, not in grand gestures, but in steady faith. As the weeks turned into months, Kingston realized he no longer thought of the oil as an experiment. It had become part of who he was, like the way he always kissed Eleanor's cheek before bed or the way he hummed softly while sanding wood. The habit wasn't something he had to remember, it was something he couldn't forget. And in that consistency lay its quiet power. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Kingston sat with Eleanor on the porch. He told her about the way the habit had changed him, not just his eyes, but his outlook. "I used to think I was losing pieces of myself," he said softly, "but now I feel like I'm gaining them back, little by little, day by day." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her smile warm. "That's what habits do, King," she whispered. "They give back what we thought was gone." And so what began as a skeptical trial became a cornerstone of Kingston's days. The secret wasn't in the oil alone, though it carried its own strength. The secret was in the habit, the act of showing up, of choosing to nurture rather than neglect, of planting seeds for a future still worth tending. It was simple, yes, but sometimes the simplest habits are the ones that save us. 6 weeks. That was how long it had been since Kingston first set the small bottle on his kitchen counter, half skeptical, half desperate. 6 weeks of swallowing a capsule with his breakfast, of letting a drop of oil settle under his tongue in the evenings, of whispering to himself that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't chasing false hope. He hadn't marked the days on a calendar, but he had felt them pass in the rhythm of his mornings, each one a quiet step forward. And now, as he sat by the window with the late summer sun slanting across the table, he realized something had shifted. The newspaper lay open before him, and for the first time in years, he was reading without interruption. No squinting, no leaning forward, no fumbling for the glasses case he had carried like a burden. The words came easily, the letters crisp. He blinked once, twice, expecting the blur to return, but it didn't. He set the paper down, staring at it as though it might explain itself. 6 weeks ago, the same page had left him frustrated, defeated. Now it felt like a gift returned. Eleanor walked in, drying her hands on a towel. She paused when she saw him, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. "What's that look for?" she asked. Kingston shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "I've been reading for half an hour," he said, "and I haven't touched my glasses once." For a moment, silence hung between them, then Eleanor's face broke into a smile. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice soft with relief. She sat down beside him, lifting the paper to see for herself. "It's working, isn't it?" Kingston didn't answer right away. He simply reached for her hand, holding it tightly. In his heart, he knew the truth. The change wasn't only in his vision, it was in his spirit. The heaviness that had followed him into the doctor's office weeks ago had begun to lift. He no longer carried the same dread of decline, the same quiet resignation that his best days were behind him. Instead, he felt possibility. He felt as though his body, despite the years, still had strength to give. And that realization was more powerful than any capsule or drop of oil. Arthur noticed the difference, too. When he stopped by to check on the garden, he found Kingston bent over the tomato plants, inspecting the leaves with ease. "You're looking sharp, King," Arthur said with a grin. Kingston laughed, shaking his head. "Sharper than I expected," he admitted. Arthur clapped him on the back. "Told you, didn't I? 6 weeks is just the start." Kingston felt a swell of gratitude toward his neighbor, not just for sharing the oil, but for planting a seed of hope when he needed it most. There was one moment that sealed it for Kingston. One evening, his granddaughter, Sophie, climbed onto his lap with a picture book. In the past, he had stumbled, squinting to make out the words, relying on his glasses to carry him through. But that night, he opened the book and began to read with ease. The letters stood clear, the colors vivid, the story flowing from his lips without pause. Sophie leaned against him, giggling at the voices he made for the characters, never knowing the quiet miracle that was unfolding in her grandfather's heart. Eleanor watched from across the room, tears glistening in her eyes. Later, she whispered, "You read to her like you used to." Kingston nodded, his voice thick. "I didn't think I'd ever have that again." Still, he carried his humility with him. He didn't boast or claim miracles. He knew his eyesight wasn't perfect and never would be. But what he had regained in 6 weeks was enough to remind him that life was still full of second chances. Each improvement, each clear moment was a reason to keep going, to keep choosing the small habit that had brought him here. The doctor noticed it too at his next appointment. After testing his eyes, the optometrist leaned back, puzzled. "You've improved again, Kingston," he said. "That's unusual for someone your age." Kingston smiled faintly, but kept his secret close. He wasn't ready to explain, not because he doubted the oil, but because he wanted to hold this discovery quietly, like a treasure he wasn't ready to share with the world just yet. At home, though, he shared everything with Eleanor. 6 weeks, he told her one night as they sat by the fire. 6 weeks, and I feel like I've turned a corner. It's not just clearer vision. It's like a fog has lifted inside me. She leaned against him, her voice tender. "That's because you're seeing yourself again, King, not just the world around you. You." Her words stayed with him long into the night, wrapping around him like a blanket of truth. As the days passed, Kingston realized that 6 weeks was only the beginning. What mattered wasn't the timeline or the results that could be measured in charts and lines. What mattered was the hope that had been restored, the quiet joy of reading to his granddaughter, the pride of sanding wood in his workshop without fear. These were the proofs that mattered, the proofs that life could still offer clarity even when the years tried to steal it away. And so, when he placed the capsule on the table the next morning, he no longer saw it as a trial or an experiment. He saw it as a companion, a small but steady ally in his fight to live fully. 6 weeks had given him sharper eyes, yes, but more than that, they had given him sharper faith. Kingston never thought much about the hidden rivers inside his body, the veins and arteries that worked quietly, carrying life to every corner. To him, health was always about what he could feel, the ache in his knees after a long day, the stiffness in his back, the sharp edge of tired eyes. But one evening, as he sat in the doctor's office reviewing his latest checkup, he was struck by something the doctor said. "Circulation is everything, Kingston, especially for your eyes. If blood doesn't flow well, your vision pays the price." The words lingered long after he left. Circulation. It was such a simple concept, yet one he had never connected to his eyesight. At home, Eleanor noticed his quiet mood and asked what was on his mind. He told her about the doctor's words, about how the very act of blood carrying oxygen and nutrients to the retina could shape whether he saw clearly or not. Eleanor, always practical, nodded. "Makes sense, doesn't it? You can't expect your eyes to work if they aren't being fed." That night, Kingston lay awake thinking about all the ways he had neglected his own circulation. Years of sitting long hours in his workshop, evenings spent too tired to move much beyond his chair, the slow creep of age that stiffened his body. It wasn't just his eyes that were starved, it was his whole self. The realization stung, but it also gave him a new kind of determination. If blood flow mattered, then he would find ways to nurture it. He started with the oil. Arthur had once mentioned that bilberry seed oil wasn't just about antioxidants, it helped improve circulation too. Kingston hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now he began to notice. His eyes didn't just feel clearer, they felt alive, less heavy, less burdened. There was a lightness, a sense that something deeper was stirring. Could it really be that the oil was giving his eyes the nourishment they had been missing? He couldn't prove it, but he could feel it. Eleanor encouraged him to walk more, at first just around the yard, then down the street, then around the block. They strolled together in the evenings, hand in hand, the air cool against their skin. Kingston found that after these walks his eyes seemed less strained. The blur that sometimes haunted him felt softer, as though the movement had stirred something good inside. He began to connect the dots, blood flowing stronger, eyes seeing clearer. It was simple, but it was real. One afternoon in his workshop, Kingston noticed how steady his hands felt as he worked the sandpaper against a chair leg. The fine lines of the wood stood out under his gaze, and he marveled at how much easier it was to focus. He thought of his father, who had struggled with circulation in his later years, swollen ankles, tired eyes, constant fatigue. Kingston wondered if things might have been different had his father known what he was only now learning. The thought filled him with gratitude for the small second chances life was giving him. The proof came not in numbers or charts, but in moments. The morning he read a recipe card without fumbling. The afternoon he spotted a sparrow's nest tucked high in the tree. The evening he looked at Eleanor across the dinner table and saw the shine in her eyes without straining. Each was a testament to the hidden rivers inside him, flowing stronger, feeding the delicate parts that allowed him to see not just with his eyes, but with his heart. Arthur, ever the encourager, shared his own story one day over coffee. "You know, King," he said, "I used to think eyesight was just about the eyes, but it's about the whole body, blood flow, heart health, even how much we move. It's all connected." Kingston nodded, the truth of it sinking deeper. For years he had separated things in his mind, the heart, the eyes, the body, but now he understood they were threads in the same fabric. Tug at one and the others followed, strengthen one and the whole cloth held firmer. That evening, Kingston told Eleanor what he had realized. "It's strange," he said, "but I think my eyes are clearer because my body is learning to flow again. The oil, the walks, it's like I'm not just feeding my eyes, I'm feeding all of me." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "That's because you are," she whispered. "You're not just living, you're nourishing yourself." Her words filled him with quiet pride. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building rather than losing, growing rather than fading. As autumn began to paint the leaves gold and red, Kingston stood at the edge of his garden and looked out. The rows of beans had wilted, the tomatoes nearly gone, but the colors of the trees seemed sharper than he could remember. He thought of blood moving through his body, carrying life to his eyes, allowing him to drink in the beauty of a world that had once begun to blur. He whispered a thank you, not just for the oil, not just for the walks, but for the lesson itself, that life flows where we tend it. And in that moment, Kingston realized something profound. His eyesight wasn't only being restored by what he took or what he did, it was being restored by the simple truth that he was learning to move again, to nourish again, to let his blood and his hope flow freely. For most of his life, Kingston thought of his heart and his eyes as two separate worlds. The heart was about beating strong, carrying him through long days in the workshop or walks in the countryside. The eyes were about seeing clearly, reading fine print, noticing the way sunlight played across Eleanor's hair. He never considered that one could depend so heavily on the other. But one afternoon, while leafing through a book on wellness at the library, he stumbled on a line that stopped him cold. Healthy circulation is the bridge between heart and vision. He read it again, slowly. The bridge between heart and vision. Suddenly, the pieces began to click. He remembered his doctor's words about circulation. He remembered Arthur mentioning how bilberry seed oil helped blood flow not only to the eyes, but throughout the whole body. He thought of the days when his heart had felt heavy, when climbing the stairs left him breathless, and how those days often coincided with the blur in his vision. Could it be that the heart and eyes had always been speaking the same language, one he simply hadn't learned to hear? That evening, as Kingston and Eleanor sat on the porch, he shared what he had read. Eleanor listened thoughtfully, then smiled. "Of course they're connected, King. The heart pumps life into everything. If the eyes don't get their share, how can they do their job?" He nodded, realizing how simple and obvious it sounded once spoken aloud. Yet for years, he had treated each struggle in isolation, his vision as one problem, his heartbeat as another. Now he began to see them as threads woven from the same spool. The next morning, as he swallowed his capsule of bilberry seed oil, he thought about the way its omega-3s and anthocyanins didn't just nourish his eyes, but supported his heart too. He pictured the blood moving freely like clear water through a river, feeding both the retina and the muscle that kept him alive. That visualization gave him a sense of wholeness. He wasn't just healing his eyes, he was strengthening the very rhythm that carried him through each day. Eleanor encouraged him to pay closer attention to how he treated his heart. They began walking more regularly, not just down the block, but through the nearby park, where autumn leaves crunched beneath their shoes. At first, Kingston tired quickly, his breath shallow, but Eleanor's hand in his steadied him, and step by step, he found a new endurance. Strangely enough, he noticed that after these walks, his eyes felt brighter, more awake. He could read for longer, work with greater ease. The forgotten link was making itself known in the rhythm of his days. One Sunday, their daughter came by with the grandchildren, and Kingston joined them for a game of tag in the yard. He laughed as he chased Sophie across the grass, his heart pounding in his chest. Later, sitting with Eleanor, he felt a kind of joy he hadn't known in years. "It's strange," he said, catching his breath. "The more I move, the more alive I feel. Not just in my body, but in my eyes, too, like one is waking up the other." Eleanor kissed his cheek. "That's because they're not separate, King. They're partners." Arthur reinforced the lesson a week later over coffee. "You want good eyes?" he said. "Take care of your heart. It's that simple. Blood flows the lifeline. Without it, nothing works as it should." Kingston nodded, thinking of the bridge again, the heart pumping, the eyes receiving, a silent partnership that had always been there waiting for him to notice. The realization changed the way he lived. He began eating differently, choosing meals that supported both his heart and eyes. He added more greens to his plate, more berries, more fish. Eleanor delighted in experimenting with new recipes, often laughing when Kingston declared, "Food for the eyes and the heart," at the dinner table. These small choices, woven together with the oil and the walks, began to feel like a tapestry of healing, each thread supporting the others. But perhaps the most powerful shift was emotional. For years, Kingston had feared his heart, the silent beats that sometimes skipped, the tightness that reminded him he was no longer young. And he had feared his eyes, the blur that threatened to steal his independence. Now he saw them differently. They weren't enemies, reminders of frailty. They were partners, working together, depending on one another. And in learning to care for both, he felt less like a man fighting a losing battle and more like one nurturing a garden with deep, intertwining roots. One evening, as the sun set in hues of pink and violet, Kingston leaned back on the porch swing and said, "You know, Elle, I think I understand something now. My eyes can only be as strong as my heart allows. And my heart can only be as steady as my choices make it." Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, her voice soft and certain. "That's the forgotten link, King, and now you've remembered." He smiled, letting the words sink deep. For the first time, he felt at peace with the truth that his body was not a collection of failing parts but a living whole, each piece relying on the other. And in tending to his heart, he had found a way to protect the clarity of his eyes and the clarity of his life. Kingston had never been vain about his looks. Wrinkles, he believed, were proof of a life lived fully, of smiles shared and worries carried. His hands were rough from decades of sanding wood and hammering nails, and he wore those calluses like badges of honor. But in the past few years, something had quietly changed. His skin had grown dry, thin, and tired-looking. Sometimes he'd glance in the mirror and hardly recognize the man staring back, a face dulled, sagging, etched with shadows that seemed deeper than memory. It wasn't until Eleanor noticed the difference that Kingston began to pay attention. One morning as she buttoned her cardigan, she looked at him closely and said, "Your skin looks different, King. Brighter somehow." He laughed, assuming she was just being kind. But later that day, as he washed up after working in the garden, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. She was right. His face wasn't youthful, not in the way of younger days, but it held a kind of glow he hadn't seen in years. The change was subtle but undeniable. The fine lines around his eyes seemed softer, the dryness on his cheeks less pronounced. Even his hands, so often cracked and weathered, looked steadier, the skin more supple. At first, Kingston thought it must have been the change of seasons or Eleanor's new soap. But as the days passed, he realized something deeper was at play. The same oil that had been feeding his eyes was now weaving its way into the very fabric of his skin. He mentioned it to Arthur one afternoon, half embarrassed. "This might sound foolish," Kingston said as they sat in the garden, "but I think my skin's changing. Eleanor says I look brighter." Arthur chuckled, sipping his tea. "Not foolish at all, King. That oil's full of what your skin craves, omega fats, antioxidants. It doesn't just work inside, it shows on the outside too." Kingston blinked, surprised. He hadn't thought of it that way. He had started taking bilberry seed oil for his eyes, not for vanity. Yet here it was, gifting him something unexpected. Eleanor seemed delighted by the transformation. She teased him gently, saying, "You're starting to look younger than me." He'd roll his eyes, but secretly her words gave him a quiet confidence. For years, he had grown used to fading into the background at family gatherings, assuming no one noticed him much. But now, even his daughter commented during Sunday lunch, "Dad, your skin looks healthier. Did you change something?" Kingston only smiled, unwilling to share all the details yet, but inside he felt a swell of gratitude. It wasn't about looking younger, that was never his goal. What mattered was how the change made him feel. Each morning, as he caught his reflection in the mirror, he didn't see a man defeated by age. He saw someone still capable of renewal. That small shift in perception carried through his days, giving him energy he hadn't felt in years. He took longer walks, worked longer hours in his shop, laughed more freely with his grandchildren. His skin's quiet glow mirrored the light he felt rekindling inside. One evening, Eleanor suggested he try adding a drop of the oil to his moisturizer. Skeptical at first, Kingston eventually gave in. To his surprise, it absorbed quickly, leaving his skin soft without the greasy film he expected. Over the following weeks, he noticed even greater improvements. The stubborn, dry patches along his jaw softened. The tired look beneath his eyes lessened. He didn't brag about it, but the change gave him comfort, a reminder that his body still responded when given what it needed. The transformation extended beyond vanity. Healthy skin meant fewer irritations, fewer moments of scratching at dry patches, fewer sighs of discomfort. It meant feeling comfortable in his own body again. He remembered how, not long ago, he used to dread photographs, avoiding the camera at birthdays or family events. Now, when his granddaughter snapped a candid photo of him holding a book, he didn't cringe at the result. Instead, he smiled, recognizing the man in the picture. The man Eleanor had loved all these years, the man who still had life in his eyes and strength in his frame. Arthur noticed too. "You've got a glow, King," he said one morning. "And it's not just the oil, it's the way you're carrying yourself." Kingston considered the words, realizing that perhaps the skin's outward change was simply reflecting the inner one. As his eyes grew clearer, his spirit lighter, and his heart stronger, it was only natural that the surface began to shine too. That night, sitting with Eleanor on the porch, Kingston spoke softly. "It feels strange, Elle. I thought I was just helping my eyes. But now, it feels like my whole body's waking up, even my skin. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. That's because you've started caring for yourself again, she whispered. Your body remembers, it responds. Her words filled him with a deep peace. In the end, the surprise of his skin transformation wasn't about vanity at all. It was about dignity, about the quiet joy of recognizing himself again when he looked in the mirror. It was about feeling whole, not broken down by time. The bilberry seed oil had given Kingston more than clearer eyes. It had given him a reflection he could smile at, a reminder that even in his 70s, renewal was still possible. And as he drifted to sleep that night, Kingston thought to himself, sometimes the greatest gifts come when we least expect them. For as long as Kingston could remember, his stomach had been his quiet burden. Not in dramatic ways, but in the small discomforts that added up over time. Bloating after dinner, sluggishness after lunch, the uneasy rhythm of digestion that often left him tired before the day was done. He'd grown used to it, chalking it up to age and the way a man's body simply slowed down. But deep down, he hated the heaviness, the way meals became something to endure rather than enjoy. Eleanor often noticed. She would glance at him across the table, her fork resting midair, and say, "King, you look uncomfortable again." He'd wave her off with a half smile, not wanting to make a fuss. But the truth was, the discomfort weighed on him, turning evenings into quiet battles against his own body. He stopped mentioning it aloud, but Eleanor knew. Wives always know. It wasn't until weeks into his new habit with bilberry seed oil that Kingston realized something curious. One evening after dinner, he leaned back in his chair, waiting for the usual heaviness to descend. But it didn't. Instead, his stomach felt calm, light, almost as though it had finally decided to work with him instead of against him. He thought little of it at first, assuming it was the meal, but then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Slowly, a pattern began to reveal itself. Eleanor noticed before he said a word. "You're not groaning tonight," she teased gently, her eyes twinkling. Kingston chuckled. "That's because there's nothing to groan about," he admitted. She tilted her head. "It's the oil, isn't it?" He thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "I think so. Somehow, it's settling me from the inside out." The change was subtle, but to Kingston, it felt monumental. For years, bloating had left him restless, pushing him to pace the living room when he wanted to relax, making him hesitant to enjoy Eleanor's cooking fully. Now the freedom of comfort was returning, and with it came a joy he hadn't expected. He savored his meals again, not with the fear of what might follow, but with gratitude for the way his body responded. One Sunday, his daughter brought over a casserole for lunch. Normally, Kingston would have approached such a heavy dish with hesitation, preparing himself for the inevitable discomfort. But this time, he ate heartily, laughing with his grandchildren at the table, noticing how light he felt afterward. His daughter, ever perceptive, raised an eyebrow. "You're not slowing down, Dad?" He shook his head with a grin. "Not this time. Feels like my body's working with me, not against me." She smiled warmly, perhaps a little relieved to see her father enjoying life so freely. Arthur, who had shared his own struggles with digestion in the past, listened intently when Kingston told him. "That doesn't surprise me," Arthur said. "What helps the eyes often helps the gut. They're connected in more ways than people realize." Kingston laughed, shaking his head. "Seems everything in this body is connected. I'm only just learning that." But it wasn't just the absence of discomfort, it was the presence of energy. Kingston noticed that after meals, he no longer dragged himself to his chair with a groan. Instead, he felt steady, alert, ready to return to his workshop or take a walk with Eleanor. The oil, in its quiet way, had restored not just his digestion, but his vitality, and that, perhaps more than anything, felt like a miracle. Eleanor began adding small touches to their meals, inspired by the changes she saw in her husband. Yogurt with breakfast, a little sauerkraut on the side of dinner, fresh vegetables from the garden. Together they discovered that these foods seemed to complement the oil's effects, creating a harmony in his gut he hadn't felt in years. "It's like a dance," Eleanor said once, smiling as she set the table. "Your body is finding its rhythm again." Kingston, chewing thoughtfully, had to agree. One evening, as they sat on the porch with the cool autumn air settling in, Kingston spoke softly. "You know, Elle, I didn't realize how much my stomach was stealing from me. The discomfort made me dread meals, made me tired before the day was through. But now, It feels like I've been given back hours of my life." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "That's because you've found balance again, King. Your body remembers how to work in harmony. You just had to give it the chance." The surprise of his gut's revival filled him with quiet gratitude. It wasn't a flashy change, nothing the world would marvel at, but for Kingston, it was life-changing. To eat without fear, to live without the weight of discomfort, to feel light again, these were gifts he didn't take lightly. As he drifted off to sleep that night, he thought of the oil, of the small habit that had rippled into so many corners of his life. His eyes clearer, his heart stronger, his skin brighter, and now his gut balanced. It was as if the oil had whispered to his body, "Remember how to be whole." And for the first time in years, Kingston believed that wholeness was possible. There was a time, not so long ago, when Kingston would forget the smallest things. He'd walk into his workshop only to stand there blankly, wondering what tool he'd come to fetch. He'd misplace his keys, then retrace his steps 3, 4 times before Eleanor finally spotted them on the counter. These weren't disasters, but they unsettled him. They whispered of decline, of a mind growing foggy in the same way his eyesight once had. For a man who prided himself on focus, on precision, these slips cut deeper than he cared to admit. Eleanor noticed. She never scolded, but sometimes her worried glance said more than words. One evening, when Kingston lost his train of thought mid-sentence, she placed her hand over his. "You're just tired, King," she said gently. But he knew it was more than that. Fatigue alone didn't explain the fog, the moments where clarity seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. It weighed on him, feeding his fear that age was not just dimming his sight, but clouding his very mind. That's why the change felt almost startling. Weeks after he had settled into his new routine with bilberry seed oil, Kingston began noticing something unexpected. He was sharper. The fog that had settled quietly over his days began to lift. He remembered where he left his keys. He recalled details of conversations without struggle. He even found himself finishing crossword puzzles that had stumped him for weeks. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence, a good stretch of days. But as the weeks passed, the pattern held. His mind felt steadier, clearer, as though someone had drawn back a curtain to let the light back in. He told Arthur about it one afternoon while they shared coffee at the kitchen table. "It's the strangest thing," Kingston said, shaking his head with a smile. "I feel sharper, like my thoughts aren't stumbling over each other anymore." Arthur grinned knowingly. "That doesn't surprise me, King. Bilberry oil feeds the brain too. Those healthy fats and antioxidants, they don't stop at your eyes. They give your mind the fuel it's been missing." Kingston sat back, letting the words sink in. He hadn't thought of it that way, but it made sense. His brain, like his eyes, needed nourishment, and now it was finally getting it. The clarity changed more than just his daily habits. It gave Kingston confidence. He no longer hesitated when speaking, no longer worried he might lose his place mid-story when reading to his grandchildren. He noticed the way Eleanor looked at him, a mix of relief and joy, as though she too felt the fog lifting. "You're yourself again," she told him one evening as they played cards. "I can see it in the way you think, the way you laugh." Her words filled him with warmth. For months, he had feared losing not just his sight, but the very essence of who he was. To feel that essence return was a gift beyond measure. One day, while working in his shop, Kingston found himself humming an old tune as he measured and cut wood for a small table. The rhythm of his thoughts matched the rhythm of his hands, smooth and steady. He hadn't worked with such focus in years. When Eleanor peeked in later, she smiled at the sight of him bent over the wood, pencil behind his ear, eyes bright with concentration. "You look 20 years younger in there," she teased. Kingston laughed, wiping the sawdust from his hands. "Feels like it too." The clarity also brought back a part of Kingston he hadn't realized he missed, his love for stories. For months, he had avoided books, frustrated by both his vision and his wandering mind. But now he returned to them eagerly, losing himself in novels the way he once had. He read aloud to Eleanor at night, his voice steady, his memory sharp enough to keep the threads of the story intact. She listened, her eyes shining, as if each word carried not just the story of the book, but the story of their life together, one of resilience, renewal, and love. When his daughter visited again, she noticed immediately. "Dad, you seem so alert," she said as they sat together. "Sharper even." Kingston chuckled. "I suppose my mind is catching up with my eyes," he replied. She smiled, though he could see the relief in her gaze. For children, there's always a quiet fear of watching their parents fade. To see her father return to himself was a comfort she didn't need to put into words. But for Kingston, the greatest proof of all came in the small, ordinary moments. The ease of recalling a neighbor's name, the quickness with which he solved a math problem while balancing the checkbook, the way he no longer stumbled when telling an old memory. These were the victories that mattered, the kind that stitched confidence back into the fabric of his days. One night, as he sat beside Eleanor on the porch, Kingston spoke softly. "You know, Elle, I used to fear losing my mind even more than losing my sight. The blur was hard enough, but the fog, that was worse. It felt like I was disappearing piece by piece." He paused, his voice thick. "But now, I feel like I've come back, like I've stepped into the light again." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice steady. "That's because you never really left, King. You just needed a little help to see yourself clearly again." Her words stayed with him as he closed his eyes that night, the cool autumn air drifting through the window. The hidden power of the oil had given him more than clearer vision. It had restored his clarity of thought, his sharpness of mind, his sense of self. And in that quiet realization, Kingston felt something deeper than relief. He felt gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance, for the fog lifting, for the reminder that even in his 70s, his mind could still shine bright. Kingston had always been the kind of man who trusted what he could feel in his bones more than what he read in books. Years in his workshop had taught him that proof was in the touch of the wood, the sound of a hammer meeting a nail, the way a chair held steady beneath weight. Still, as his eyes grew clearer, his skin brighter, and his mind sharper, there was a small voice inside him that wondered, is this just me, or is there really something to it? One evening, while Eleanor was knitting by the fire, Kingston flipped through a health magazine their daughter had left behind. He wasn't expecting much, just a distraction, but then a headline caught his eye. "Studies show bilberry extract supports vision and circulation in seniors." His heart quickened. He leaned forward, tracing the words with his finger. The article described research where older adults who took bilberry extract experienced measurable improvements in vision and blood flow after just a few months. It was as though the page had been written about him. When Eleanor noticed his silence, she asked what had stolen his attention. Kingston read a passage aloud, his voice trembling slightly. Participants reported clearer vision, reduced eye strain, and better circulation to the retina. He lowered the magazine, looking at her with wide eyes. "That's exactly what I've been feeling, Elle." "Exactly." Eleanor smiled softly, her knitting needles clicking. "So now you have your proof," she said. "Not just in your own life, but in the words of those who study it." The validation brought Kingston a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was waiting for. For weeks, he had trusted the changes in his body, but now, knowing that science confirmed what he felt, made it easier to share his story with others. He no longer worried about sounding foolish or gullible. He wasn't chasing superstition. He was standing on ground that others had tested and proven. The next time Arthur stopped by, Kingston showed him the magazine. "Look here," he said, tapping the page. "They've studied it, Art. It's not just stories, it's real." Arthur grinned, his eyes crinkling. "Told you, King, sometimes science just catches up with what we've already discovered." Kingston chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It was true. His own life had been proof enough, but having the studies there, written and tested, gave him the kind of reassurance he didn't know he craved. At his next checkup, Kingston cautiously mentioned it to his doctor. "I've been trying something new," he said carefully. The doctor raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" Kingston explained about the bilberry seed oil, the capsules, the changes he had felt in his eyes, his energy, even his mind. To his surprise, the doctor didn't dismiss it. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "There's growing evidence for that, actually," he said. "Some patients do notice real improvements." The words were like a weight lifted from Kingston's shoulders. He had feared skepticism, but instead, he found affirmation. Walking out of the office that day, he felt lighter, prouder. He wasn't imagining things. He wasn't clinging to false hope. What he was experiencing was real, and now he had the words of both science and his doctor to carry with him. That night, as he and Eleanor sat on the porch watching the stars, Kingston spoke softly. "You know, Elle, it's not just me anymore, it's bigger than that. They've studied it, they've measured it. What I'm feeling, it's true for others too." Eleanor reached for his hand, her eyes warm. "I never doubted you, King," she whispered, "but I'm glad you have the proof you need." The confirmation deepened Kingston's commitment. He no longer saw his morning capsule as an experiment, but as a practice grounded in both faith and fact. It wasn't just a ritual of hope, it was a step supported by truth, and that combination gave him the courage to dream further, to believe that the changes he was experiencing might continue, might even grow stronger with time. In the weeks that followed, Kingston began sharing his story more openly. At the community center, he spoke to neighbors about his experience. He didn't preach or pressure, he simply told his truth, weaving his journey of blurred vision, frustration, and discovery into a story that others could hold on to. To his surprise, people listened with interest, even gratitude. Some nodded knowingly, others asked questions, and a few admitted they had heard similar stories, but hadn't known whether to believe them. Eleanor watched proudly as her husband stepped into this new role, not as a teacher or expert, but as a living example. "You've become proof yourself, King," she told him one evening. "Science confirms it on paper, but you confirm it with your life." Kingston blushed at her words, but deep down, he knew she was right. His journey wasn't just about his own healing anymore. It was about showing others that renewal was possible, that hope could be grounded in reality, that age didn't have to mean surrender. One afternoon, while sanding a piece of oak in his workshop, Kingston paused, staring at the fine grain of the wood. He thought about how each ring in the tree told a story of seasons, growth, struggle, survival. Science, he realized, was much the same. It measured, recorded, and told the story of what was possible. But the real proof was in the living, in the feeling, in the quiet joy of seeing clearly again. And in that moment, he felt both humbled and grateful to be part of a story larger than himself. Kingston often marveled at how something so small could change so much. The capsules sat in a neat row on the counter, no bigger than the beans he used to plant each spring. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, forgettable. But each morning when he placed one on his tongue and washed it down with a sip of water, he was reminded that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest of steps. When he started, he had expected little, maybe a slight improvement, maybe nothing at all. But months later, the proof was all around him. He could read without strain, walk without the heavy fog clouding his eyes, and even Eleanor admitted that his laughter had returned to its old ease. He often thought back to those early days of skepticism when he had wondered if he was foolish for trying. Now the capsules had become not just a habit, but a lifeline. Eleanor teased him about his devotion to them. "You guard those bottles as though they're gold," she said one evening, her voice light with affection. Kingston chuckled. "Well, they're worth more than gold to me," he replied. "They've given me back pieces of myself I thought were gone." She smiled, leaning closer. "It's not just the capsules, King. It's you choosing to keep going." He knew she was right, but he also knew the oil had been the bridge that carried him back to hope. One Sunday afternoon, their daughter asked him what had changed. "You seem so alive lately, Dad," she said, her eyes curious. Kingston smiled, considering how to explain. He picked up one of the capsules and held it out. "This," he said simply. "It doesn't look like much, but it's changed everything." She studied it, her expression thoughtful. "Something so small," she murmured, "but look at the difference it's made." The truth was, the capsules had become more than a routine. They were a symbol of choice. Each morning, Kingston chose to take them, and in doing so, he chose life, resilience, and presence. He chose to keep his eyes sharp for Eleanor's smile, for his grandchildren's laughter, for the beauty of the world that still unfolded around him. What once felt like surrender had become a daily declaration. "I'm still here, I'm still capable, I'm still choosing to see." Arthur, always supportive, noticed the change in Kingston's demeanor. "You carry yourself differently these days," he said. "It's not just your eyes, King, it's your spirit. Those capsules aren't just feeding your body, they're feeding your hope." Kingston nodded, grateful for the reminder. He had spent too many months believing age was a slow fade into loss. Now, each capsule reminded him that growth was still possible, even in his 70s. The difference showed in the smallest of moments. One evening, as he read aloud to Eleanor, he realized he hadn't stumbled once. The words flowed smoothly, his eyes carrying him with ease. He glanced at her and saw the joy in her expression, the way she leaned into his voice as if it were music. Later, as they sat in quiet companionship, he thought about how something so tiny, a capsule swallowed without fanfare, had given him back something so immeasurable. Kingston also noticed his confidence returning in social spaces. At the community center, he no longer avoided reading aloud or participating in group games. He spoke with clarity, his eyes meeting those around him with steadiness. Neighbors who had once noticed his hesitancy now remarked on his energy. One woman even asked, "What's your secret, Kingston?" He smiled modestly, unwilling to oversell, but inside he knew the truth. The secret was simply choosing a small act each day that rippled into every part of his life. Eleanor often reflected on the change as well. "You're lighter, King," she said one morning as they walked hand in hand. "Not just in body, but in spirit. Those capsules didn't just sharpen your vision, they reminded you of who you are." Her words touched him deeply. He thought back to the heaviness he had carried months ago, the despair of blurred vision and foggy thoughts. That man felt distant now, like a shadow he had left behind. One evening, Kingston held a capsule between his fingers and stared at it thoughtfully. He realized it wasn't just about the oil inside. It was about the power of small things, the way a single seed can grow into a tree, the way one act of kindness can change a day, the way a habit can transform a life. He smiled, tucking the capsule back into its case, grateful for the lesson it carried. As the night settled in, he and Eleanor sat on the porch, stars glittering above. "Funny, isn't it?" Kingston mused. "That something so small could give us so much back." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "That's the way life works, King. It's the little things that end up meaning the most." And as Kingston closed his eyes, breathing in the cool night air, he knew she was right. The small capsule was more than medicine. It was a daily reminder that life could still change, still surprise, still offer him new beginnings, even after 70 years. Kingston had always thought of his glasses as a tool, nothing more. A tool he didn't particularly like, but one he couldn't live without. They sat on his nightstand, rode along in his shirt pocket, and perched on the bridge of his nose for nearly every task. He tolerated them the way one tolerates an old ache, grumbling but resigned. But as weeks turned into months with his new routine, something began to shift. Slowly, almost without him noticing, the glasses spent more time folded in their case than sitting on his face. The realization came one afternoon when Eleanor found him in the garden. He was bent over the tomato vines, trimming leaves and tying twine when she stopped in her tracks. "King," she called, her voice a little surprised, "where are your glasses?" He straightened, blinking in the sunlight. For a moment, he reached toward his shirt pocket, thinking he must have dropped them, but the pocket was empty. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I suppose I don't need them right now." Eleanor's smile was wide, her eyes shimmering. "You haven't said that in years." The freedom felt intoxicating. It wasn't that Kingston no longer needed glasses altogether. He still reached for them at times, especially with the smallest print. But to move through his day without the constant crutch, to work with his hands, to read his paper, to look at Eleanor across the room without lenses between them, those were victories that fed his spirit. Each moment without glasses was a moment of reclaiming himself. He noticed the difference in his workshop most of all. For years, he had grown frustrated when the blur forced him to stop, to adjust his glasses, to recheck measurements. Now he moved with a steadiness he thought he had lost. The fine grooves in the wood appeared clearly, the markings on his ruler crisp under his gaze. He no longer felt like a man stumbling through his craft, but like the craftsman he had always been, capable, precise, proud. Confidence bloomed quietly. At the community center, he no longer hesitated when asked to read aloud from a shared text. His voice rang steady, his eyes following the words with ease. Neighbors who had once watched him fumble with his glasses now remarked on his energy, his ease. One woman smiled knowingly and said, "You look 10 years younger without those things." Kingston laughed, but inside, her words struck a chord. It wasn't vanity, it was freedom. Even the grandchildren noticed. "Grandpa, you're not wearing your glasses," Sophie exclaimed one afternoon, her voice full of wonder. Kingston chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not today, sweetheart." She giggled and clapped her hands. To her, it seemed like a small miracle, and in many ways, it was. For Kingston, it was a reminder that age didn't always have to mean decline. Sometimes it meant surprising everyone, including himself. Eleanor perhaps felt the change most deeply. She saw the way Kingston carried himself differently, shoulders straighter, eyes brighter. One evening, as they sat together with the soft glow of a lamp between them, she reached for his hand. "You know what I love most about this?" she asked. Kingston raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" She smiled. "I can see you again, not just through glass, just you." His throat tightened with emotion. He hadn't realized how much the barrier of lenses had shaped their quiet moments together. To look into her eyes directly without anything in between, that was a gift beyond measure. The confidence extended beyond sight. It seeped into the way Kingston spoke, the way he laughed, the way he approached each day. He no longer felt like a man trying to hide his frailties. He felt like a man still capable of meeting the world head-on. The glasses, once a symbol of what he was losing, had become instead a reminder of what he had regained. Arthur noticed it too. "You've got your spark back, King," he said one afternoon as they shared coffee. "And it's not just because you're seeing clearer, it's because you're living clearer." Kingston nodded, recognizing the truth. The oil, the habits, the changes, they had all worked together to give him back not just his vision, but his sense of self. One evening, as the day faded into twilight, Kingston sat on the porch with Eleanor. He set his glasses down on the table beside him, folded neatly, untouched. "Funny, isn't it?" he mused. "I used to think these defined me, that they were the sign of what I'd lost. Now setting them aside feels like reclaiming everything I still have." Eleanor leaned against him, her voice gentle. "That's because you've remembered who you are, King. Glasses or no glasses, you've remembered." As the stars appeared in the sky, Kingston closed his eyes, breathing in the cool air. He knew he would still need his glasses sometimes, and that was all right. But what mattered was the freedom to choose, the confidence to live without them when he could. That confidence, more than anything, was the gift he would carry forward. And as he drifted toward sleep that night, Kingston smiled to himself. Glasses off, confidence back on. It was more than a phrase, it was a truth that had reshaped his life. Autumn had settled in full around Kingston's home. The leaves drifted down in quiet spirals, the air grew crisper, and the evenings came earlier. As he stood at the edge of the garden one afternoon, he thought about how much could change in just a year. Not long ago, he had felt trapped in a world that was growing dimmer, each day blurring into the next. He had braced himself for decline, for the slow surrender to glasses, to foggy thoughts, to a body he no longer trusted. But now, standing in the cool light of a late afternoon, he realized he had found a new path, one he hadn't known existed after 60. It wasn't just the oil, though that had been the spark. It was the way the small habit had rippled into every part of his life. His vision had sharpened, yes, but so had his spirit. His mornings carried purpose, his afternoons energy, his evenings peace. The man who once sat in silence, weighed down by fear, now moved with quiet confidence, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer. The change was not dramatic in a single moment. It was steady, patient, unfolding like the turning of the seasons. Eleanor saw it most clearly. She had walked beside him through the shadows, watched him struggle with blur and doubt, heard the heaviness in his voice when he spoke of surrender. And now she saw the light that had returned, the spark in his laughter, the clarity in his gaze. "You've come back to me, King," she whispered one night as they sat on the porch. He turned to her, emotion thick in his throat. "No, Elle," he said softly. "I never left. I just had to find my way back." Their children noticed too. During Sunday dinners, their daughter remarked on how engaged he seemed, how present. "Dad, you don't just look better. You are better," she said, her voice full of relief. Kingston smiled, humbled by her words. He didn't feel like a man defying age. He felt like a man learning to live it differently, a man choosing to walk a new path, one paved not with resignation, but with resilience. The community center, once a place where he sat quietly at the edge, became a space of connection again. He joined in games, read aloud during gatherings, even shared his story when asked. At first, he had been hesitant, unsure of how people might respond. But when neighbors leaned in, their eyes filled with curiosity and hope, he realized that his journey was not his alone. Many carried the same fears, the same quiet burdens, and in his story, they found a glimmer of possibility. Arthur remained his closest companion through it all. Over countless cups of coffee, the two men spoke of aging not as a decline, but as a different kind of living. "We're not done, King," Arthur said one afternoon, his voice firm. "We just need to take different roads now." Kingston nodded, recognizing the truth. The oil, the walks, the meals Eleanor prepared with care, they were all roads leading him forward toward a life still worth savoring. The most powerful change, however, was inward. Kingston no longer feared the mirror. Where once he had seen a stranger with tired eyes and worn skin, now he saw himself, a man weathered but steady, aged but alive. He no longer defined himself by what he had lost, but by what he had regained: clarity, confidence, presence. He had discovered that clear vision was not just about what his eyes could see, but about how he chose to see his life. One evening, as the first frost of the season dusted the garden, Kingston and Eleanor wrapped themselves in blankets and sat together on the porch. The stars stretched above them, sharp and bright against the dark sky. Kingston looked up, marveling at how clear they appeared. He thought of the boy he had once been, lying in a field, staring at the same stars with unclouded eyes. And now, decades later, he was seeing them again, not as a boy, but as a man who had learned the value of clarity after nearly losing it. He turned to Eleanor, his voice low but certain. "You know, Elle, I used to think life after 60 was about managing loss, losing eyesight, losing strength, losing moments. But now I see it differently. It's about finding new ways to live, new paths to walk. My eyes may have grown dim, but they've also taught me how to see more deeply." Eleanor smiled, her hand warm in his. "That's because you chose the path of hope, King, and that makes all the difference." As the night deepened, Kingston felt a profound peace settle over him. He knew the years ahead would still carry challenges. Age had its way of humbling even the strongest, but he no longer feared what was coming. He had found tools, habits, and choices that gave him strength. He had found a path that allowed him to walk forward with clarity rather than stumble in the dark. The new path wasn't just about avoiding glasses, it was about reclaiming dignity, discovering resilience, and realizing that even in his 70s, life could still surprise him with second chances. As he drifted into sleep that night, Eleanor's head resting on his shoulder, Kingston whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for the oil, for the journey, for the chance to see not just the world, but his own life with fresh eyes. And so his story became not just one of restored vision, but of restored living. A reminder to himself, and perhaps to others, that after 60, the path ahead is not closed. It is simply waiting to be seen. Kingston's journey began with fear, the blur of words on a page, the quiet dread of glasses becoming permanent, the worry that life was slipping away one detail at a time. At 71, he sat in a doctor's office bracing for decline, believing that blurred vision and tired eyes were simply part of growing old. But what he discovered was that age doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means finding new paths, hidden in the smallest of choices. Through the encouragement of a friend, Kingston tried something unexpected: bilberry seed oil. What began as a simple daily habit slowly unfolded into transformation. His eyes grew sharper, his mornings brighter, his skin renewed, his digestion balanced, his mind clearer. Each capsule wasn't just about oil, it was a declaration that he wasn't finished yet. Glasses that once felt like chains became tools he used sparingly, no longer symbols of defeat, but reminders of the progress he had made. Along the way, Kingston rediscovered confidence. He returned to his workshop with steady hands, read to his grandchildren with laughter in his voice, and shared evenings with Eleanor without the weight of despair in his eyes. His story is not about miracles, but about resilience, about how even in the later chapters of life, clarity of vision, of mind, of spirit can return when we choose to nurture it. And now, as his story rests in your hands, the question turns to you. What small step will you take for yourself today? Age may try to dim the world around you, but like Kingston, you can choose a path of renewal. You can choose clarity. You can choose to see your life, not as it fades, but as it continues to shine.